Okay, so this is a story I gotta tell. It's been eating at me for a decade, this memory that just won't let go. It's about this crazy trip I took with my friends to an abandoned logging camp in the Alaskan wilderness. It was the summer of 2005, and we were all fresh out of college, ready for adventure. My buddy Mark was obsessed with this old logging camp he'd found on some ancient maps. He was convinced it was this untouched piece of history, just waiting to be explored. "It'll be epic," Mark kept saying, his eyes all lit up. "Just us, the mountains, and a whole camp to ourselves." The camp was way out in the middle of nowhere, accessible only by this overgrown mining road that cut through miles of forest. The logging companies had given up on the place decades ago. The trees were too big, too remote, not worth the effort. They just left everything behind. Mark had found it while researching for his history degree, and he was determined to see it for himself. He'd already convinced his girlfriend, Julie, to go with him, and now he was trying to rope us in. "Come on, it'll be an adventure," he pleaded. "Think about it, we'll be the first people there in over 50 years. Julie looked a bit hesitant, but she was smiling at Mark like he was the only guy in the world. Our friend Steve, though, wasn't buying it. "You're crazy, man," he said, shaking his head. "Why would we hike all that way just to see some abandoned shed?" "It's more than a shed," Mark insisted. "Here are bunkhouses, equipment, even an old steam locomotive." Steve still wasn't convinced, but Jake and I were starting to get interested. As Julie and Mark debated, I looked up at the Alaska night sky. The stars were incredible, brighter than I'd ever seen them before. Maybe it was the wilderness vibe, but suddenly, the idea didn't seem so crazy anymore. "Look, you really think it's still there?" Jake asked. "Couldn't it have collapsed or rotted away by now?" Mark shrugged. "Who knows? Even if the camp is gone, think of the hike. When's the last time any of us did something like this?" I felt this restlessness wash over me. We just graduated, and the future was looming: job hunting, rent payments, the whole 9 yards. "I don't know about you guys," I said, "but I'd rather try to find some abandoned locomotive than start filling out job applications." Jake laughed. "All right, I'm in. Let's do this." Steve groaned, but he finally gave in. "Fine," he said. "But if we get eaten by bears, I'm blaming you, Mark." We spent the next week planning and gathering gear. Mark was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement, and the way he was looking at Julie, it was clear this trip was about more than just exploring some old camp. Early one Saturday morning, we loaded up Mark's SUV and headed for the mountains. As we left the paved roads behind, I felt a mix of excitement and doubt. Were we really cut out for this? The mining road was rough, but Mark's SUV handled it like a champ. We bumped along for miles, the forest getting denser and denser. "No turning back now," Jake said, and I could hear the nervousness in his voice. As the sun started to set, Julie asked, "Shouldn't we camp soon?" But Mark was determined to keep going. We drove on, headlights cutting through the darkness, until we finally emerged into a clearing, and there it was, the abandoned logging camp. It was incredible, this huge barn-like structure, bathed in moonlight. We just sat there, speechless, taking it all in. We were the first people to see this place in decades. We reached the logging camp in the late afternoon. The shadows from the trees were already getting long, but we could still see the whole place clearly. Jake let out a low whistle as he took in the sight of the decaying buildings. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "It really is still here." There were 3 big bunkhouses, a massive barn, and a bunch of rusted machinery scattered around. At the far end, we could see the metal frame of a steam locomotive, half hidden by bushes and weeds. "Told you guys this would be epic," Mark said, grinning. "No, let's find a spot to set up camp before it gets dark." We drove to a flat area near the trees and unloaded our gear. The air was damp, and mosquitoes were swarming around us like crazy. "These things are vicious," Steve complained, swatting at his neck. "Mark, there better not be mosquitoes like this the whole time we're out here." Mark just laughed. "We're in their territory now. Just keep spraying that bug spray." Once the tents were up, we went to gather firewood. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It already felt different from any other place I'd been. Steve got a fire going in a stone fire pit, and we huddled around it as the sun went down. We ate our simple dinner of beans and hot dogs, feeling the warmth of the flames chase away the evening chill. "To adventure?" Mark said, raising his tin cup of whiskey. We clinked our cups together and laughed. The whiskey warmed me up from the inside, and soon we were swapping stories and jokes. Mark kept scooting closer to Julie on the log they were sharing, and she was leaning into him with a smile. Seeing them like that made me miss my own girlfriend back home. "All right, I gotta know," Jake said, turning to Mark. "How'd you convince Julie to come out to this abandoned camp with you?" Julie blushed, and Mark grinned. "Let's just say I can be very persuasive. Just asked her to go on a crazy adventure with me," Mark said, giving Julie a quick kiss. "Who could say no to that?" "Well, I think Julie needs to be checked for insanity," Steve joked. We all laughed, but there was still this underlying tension. We were out in the middle of nowhere, after all. As the fire died down, I started to feel exhausted. We'd been driving and hiking all day, and my sleeping bag was calling my name. "Good night, guys," I said, yawning. I crawled into my tent and snuggled into my sleeping bag. The nylon walls of the tent crinkled in the breeze, and the voices of my friends faded away as I drifted off to sleep. Sometime later, I woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the campfire. The woods were bathed in moonlight, and I could hear my friends still chatting and joking. I smiled to myself, feeling happy and comforted, and drifted back to sleep. The next morning was damp and gray. A thick mist hung between the trees, muffling all sound. I quickly pulled on my boots and jacket, eager to get to the fire. My friends were already up, huddled around a small fire Steve had rekindled. We drank our instant coffee, shivering in the morning chill. "So, what's the plan today?" Julie asked. Mark blew on his hands and looked towards the old buildings. "I want to check out those bunkhouses and see if there's any equipment left inside," Steve groaned. "You mean we have to move? Can't we just sit by the fire all day?" "Come on, we didn't come all this way just to sit around," Mark said. We finished our coffee and followed him across the clearing. Our boots crunched on the gravel and broken glass as we approached the dilapidated bunkhouse. The front door creaked open, revealing a large room filled with debris. This must have been where the workers lived, Mark said, his voice echoing in the empty space. The bunk beds were falling apart, and there were no mattresses or blankets. An old wood stove stood against one wall, covered in dust and cobwebs. "No one's cleaned this place in a long time," I said, running my finger through the grime on a windowsill. Julie wandered over to a shelf filled with cracked dishes and cups. "Strange to think people used to wake up here every morning, make coffee, go to work," she said. "All these years later, just left exactly as it was," Steve added. He scratched at some peeling paint on the wall. Mark peered into a locker. "Wonder if these would still fit any of us," he said, grinning. Jake was looking at an old typewriter on a desk. Scattered around were weathered notebooks. "Looks like these were the logger's daily reports," he said. "This one is dated August 13th, 1949. Says, cut down 25 spruce today, mostly young growth. Mosquitoes fierce near the ridge." He trailed off, carefully turning the pages. A strange silence fell over the room as we imagined the workers writing by lantern light, swatting mosquitoes, their daily lives recorded in these crumbling notebooks. I noticed some old photos on the wall. They were black and white pictures of lumberjacks posing with huge logs. "Tough-looking bunch," I commented. Mark nodded. They had to be, to work in these conditions every day. I stared at their weathered faces, trying to picture them sitting around at the end of a long day, playing cards and smoking. They were just ghosts now, captured in these fading photographs. "Crazy how this was all just left behind," Steve said. Julie shivered. "It does kind of feel like we're trespassing, seeing all this." We were quiet again, thinking about the people who had lived and worked here. A half played chessboard on an overturned barrel, initials carved into a bedpost, stacks of old newspapers, echoes of lives long gone. "We should probably get moving," Mark said, breaking the silence. "Still more to explore out there." I took one last look around the gloomy room before following my friends back outside. As we walked, I glanced back at our tents. Something about the campsite looked different. I stopped and turned to get a better look. There, among the trees surrounding our tents, were strange markings carved into the trunks. "Hey guys, check this out," I said, pointing. "What is it?" Jake asked. "There's something carved on those trees near our tents. Can't really make it out from here, but it looks weird." We walked over to get a closer look. As we got nearer, the markings became clearer. They were definitely not natural. Intricate symbols and lines had been carved into several of the tree trunks. "Whoa, these are creepy looking," Steve said, leaning in to examine one. It looked vaguely Celtic, with loops and spirals gouged deep into the bark. Mark ran his hand over another symbol, a circle with a line through it. "These almost look like runes or something," he said, glancing around uneasily. "Were these here when we arrived yesterday?" I shook my head. "I don't remember seeing any strange markings. I think I would have noticed something like this near our tents." We exchanged nervous glances. The forest suddenly felt a lot more ominous. Who could have done this overnight? And what did the strange symbols mean? Maybe it was another camping group passing through, Julie suggested, but she didn't sound convinced. Mark examined a few more of the marked trunks. "I don't know. These look pretty deliberately carved. Not just some random vandalism." The symbols gave me an uneasy feeling, like we were being watched. I half expected to see someone peering out from behind the trees, but all was still and silent. "Fan out, guys," Mark said. "Let's see if there are any more around here." We spread out, searching for more markings. "Found another one over here," Jake called out. We gathered around the deeply etched symbol he was examining. It was a simple circle with a diagonal line through it, different from the Celtic-looking ones. "This is really strange," I muttered. "Who would come all the way out here just to do this?" Mark shook his head. "I know. I was excited to find this camp, but I can't imagine another group hiking all the way out here just to carve up trees." We kept searching and found more carved trunks, leading away from our campsite and into the dense forest. They seemed to follow a winding path. I felt a shiver run down my spine as we passed a birch tree etched with a symbol that looked like a spider. Something about these markings disturbed me, like a warning sign in an ancient language. "Guys, I don't like this," Julie said, her voice trembling. "It's like someone was leaving a trail right to our campsite." "Yeah, this is all really creepy," Steve agreed. "Any chance this is your idea of a prank, Mark?" Mark held up his hands. "You really think I'd sneak around carving spooky symbols on trees? This wasn't us. That only deepened the mystery. We were miles from any roads or trails. Was someone else out here in these remote woods?" The whole atmosphere felt different now, charged with an unsettling energy. I wanted to pack up and leave, but at the same time, I was captivated by the strange symbols. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were clues to something bigger, even if my rational mind resisted such thoughts. Mark pulled out his hatchet and tapped it against a tree trunk. "You know, I'd like to follow this trail a bit and see where it leads. Maybe we can figure out who's doing this." Steve looked like he was about to bolt. "Yeah, I don't know, man. Maybe we should just leave it alone." "I'm with Steve," Julie said, her face pale. "This feels wrong. Let's just go." Mark looked at Jake and me, his eyebrows raised. I understood Julie's fear, but the mystery was too tempting to ignore. "I say we see where the trail leads," I said, ignoring Julie's worried sigh. "Hey, as long as we stick together and stay alert, but no splitting up, Pop." Mark grinned. "You got it. We'll track this just a bit and see if we can spot anyone else out here." With Jake and me on board, Steve reluctantly agreed to come along. Safety in numbers, I guess. I could tell Julie was nervous as we followed the trail deeper into the shadowy forest, but she stayed close to Mark, her jaw set in determination. We hiked for what felt like hours, the trail wending through the dense forest. The symbols we followed were getting weirder and weirder, intricate patterns carved deep into the bark, some fresh, some old. It was definitely deliberate, not just random vandalism. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone watching us from the trees. The normal sounds of the forest seemed muted, replaced by an unsettling silence. "This place gives me the creeps," Julie said, shivering. "Those symbols, the trail, it's like something out there is watching us." Mark put a comforting arm around her. "We don't know that for sure. Could just be some weird local tradition we're not aware of." But he didn't sound convinced. "I'm with Julie," Steve said, his voice shaky. "This is seriously freaky. I say we get the hell out of here first thing tomorrow." I stared into the trees, torn between fear and curiosity. "What do you guys think the symbols mean?" I asked. "Maybe it's some kind of ancient language," Jake suggested. "Like a lost native tribe or something, living out here." Steve snorted. "A lost tribe? Come on, man. This isn't a cheesy movie." "Hey, you got a better explanation," Jake shot back. Steve just shook his head and went back to nervously whittling his stick. "It is pretty remote out here," I said slowly. "If some group wanted to disappear, I imagine these woods would be perfect for it." Mark nodded. "I've read about hermits and holdouts still hiding deep in the wilderness, but carving up trees is an odd way to stay hidden. Whatever is doing this, I wish it would leave us alone," Julie said, throwing a stick into the fire. "It feels targeted, like we're being tracked." A heavy silence fell over us as we considered the possibilities. Even with my friends around me, I'd never felt so exposed and vulnerable. The forest was a wall of darkness, barely held back by our small fire. As the night wore on, we kept debating the mystery in hushed voices. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and one by one they went to sleep. Mark and I were the last ones awake. You should get some rest, I told him. I'll keep watch. He nodded gratefully and squeezed my shoulder. Thanks, man. Just a few hours. Keep that fire going. I stoked the embers as Mark headed to his tent. Now alone, the dark forest seemed to press in even closer. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made my heart pound. I kept glancing nervously at the trees, dreading the moment some creature might emerge from the shadows. When my eyelids started to droop, I piled more wood on the fire, welcoming the light and warmth that pushed back the darkness. But despite my best efforts, sleep eventually crept in. Sometime before dawn, I woke with a start. Jake was shaking my shoulder, his face pale in the dim light. Alex, look, he whispered, pointing towards the trees. My heart sank as I saw what he was pointing at. Carved into the trees surrounding our campsite were more of the bizarre symbols. They followed us, Julie said, her voice filled with fear. Mark ran a hand over his face. This can't be a coincidence. Something out there is tracking us, moving in the night. Then let's not stick around to find out what. Steve urged, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. We need to hike straight back to the cars today. No more detours. I stared at the ominous symbols, my skin crawling. I imagined unseen eyes watching us as we slept. Steve's right, I said. We should head back. It felt like admitting defeat, but we were shaken and needed to regroup. As we prepared to leave, Mark started following another trail of freshly carved symbols leading away from the camp. He turned back to us, his face determined. You guys hike out if you want, he said, but I need to see where this goes. Something strange is happening here, and I'm going to get to the bottom of it. Julie rushed to his side. Mark, please, this is dangerous. We should go back together. But I could see in his eyes that his mind was made up. Jake and Steve decided to head back with Julie, but I couldn't leave Mark alone. I'll go with Mark, I told the others. To watch his back. We'll catch up soon. They reluctantly agreed and started packing up. I saw fear and relief mixed in their expressions. Part of me wanted to go with them, but I felt a sense of loyalty to Mark. Mark gave Julie a long hug and whispered something in her ear. Then, he and I took a deep breath and headed off into the trees. We hiked in silence, following the trail of disturbing symbols. Part of me still couldn't believe we were doing this instead of running back to safety. But I knew Mark wouldn't turn back, and I couldn't abandon him. We walked for nearly an hour without speaking. The symbols led us on a winding path, past massive trees dripping with moss. I had completely lost my sense of direction. Mark paused to examine another symbol carved into the bark of a spruce tree. This one looked like a skeletal hand with long, sharp fingers. Just looking at it made me uneasy. Mark traced the grooves with his fingers, his brow furrowed. These seem to be getting more intense, he said. Or maybe ritualistic is the word. Definitely not just random vandalism. I shivered, imagining someone carving these symbols into the tree with a sharp blade. What kind of person would do this? And why? Mark pulled out his hatchet and gripped it tightly. Let's keep moving, but stay alert. No telling if whoever is doing this is still out there. I nodded, scanning the trees nervously. The shadows were deep, and anyone could be hiding in them. We continued following the symbols, the tension growing with each new one we found. They were appearing more frequently now, and they were becoming more elaborate, forming disturbing shapes and patterns. I stopped when I noticed deep scratches ringing a tree at waist height. They looked like claw marks. Mark, look at this, I said, my voice shaking. He came over and examined the scratches. Jesus, he whispered. Looks like something was trying to claw right through the trunk. The fear in his voice startled me. Mark was usually fearless, always up for an adventure. But now, he looked pale and shaken. Mark, I think we should turn back, I said. Whatever is down here doing these things, I don't think we want to find it. He stared at the tree for a moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, let's get the hell out of here, he rasped. I've seen enough. We turned and started backtracking, trying to retrace our steps. I tried not to think about unseen eyes watching us from the trees. We walked for a while, but then the trail of symbols just disappeared. Where did they go? Mark asked, panic creeping into his voice. We searched the area, but the trail was gone. It was like we'd crossed some invisible line, and the carver of the symbols didn't want us to go any further. Adrenaline surged through me as I realized we were lost. Completely lost. Can you remember the way back? I asked Mark, my voice trembling. He shook his head, his eyes darting around frantically. No, it all looks the same. We must have gotten off track somewhere. I tried to stay calm, but fear was overwhelming me. We were alone, vulnerable, lost in this nightmarish forest. I pulled out my compass. At least we knew which way was south, the general direction of the camp. But who knew how far away it was, or what lay between us and safety? We'll just keep heading south, Mark said, trying to sound positive. As long as we don't deviate. We've got to run into something familiar sooner or later. Neither of us believed it, but we had no other choice. We gripped our gear and started trudging through the trackless woods, heading south. The trees were silent, offering no clues. Time seemed to crawl by. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made us jump. As darkness fell, we knew we had to make camp. We gathered fallen branches and built a fire, the flames pushing back the encroaching darkness. We huddled close to the warmth, chewing on our remaining trail mix in silence. A bone. Deep chill settled over me, and I could see the fear in Mark's eyes. Neither of us dared to voice the terrifying questions running through our minds. What was carving those symbols into the trees? Exhaustion eventually won out, and I fell into a fitful sleep. But each time I woke up, it was from the same nightmare running through an endless maze of trees, with something monstrous chasing me. Mark's face, illuminated by the firelight, told me he was having the same nightmares. Dawn brought little comfort. We were still lost, and the woods were just as frightening in the daylight. But we forced ourselves to keep moving, heading south. We ignored our hunger, our thirst, our exhaustion. Those were minor discomforts compared to what might be waiting for us if we didn't find our way out. By late afternoon, we were on the verge of collapse. The woods seemed even thicker now, more alien. Hope was fading fast. But then, the trees ahead opened up, and we stumbled into a clearing. My heart leaped with joy. Finally, a change in the endless sea of trees. But as we entered the clearing, what we saw drained every last ounce of hope from our bodies. In the center lay the body of a large elk, its throat slit open, blood staining the ground. Strange symbols were carved into its sides. Mark looked like he was about to be sick, and I had to turn away, gagging. This was the work of whatever had been carving those symbols into the trees. And it was here. After the gruesome discovery in the clearing, Mark and I stumbled on for what felt like days. The woods were a blur, each shadowy thicket identical to the last. The compass kept us heading south, but we could have been walking in circles for all we knew. We've got to find water soon, Mark muttered, swatting at mosquitoes. Can't keep this up with no supplies." I barely registered his words. My legs were leaden, my feet blistered and raw, but stopping felt even more dangerous than pressing on. As the light began to fade, we desperately searched for a place to camp, but the trees offered no respite. Finally, too exhausted to go any further, we slumped against a massive cedar tree and shared our last bit of trail mix. "Here," Mark said, holding out the nearly empty bag. "Make sure to save a handful for the morning." I took a small portion and passed it back, unable to meet his eyes. We were in survival mode now. With no chance of building a fire, we unrolled our sleeping bags beneath the cedar branches. The woods were deathly silent, and I felt completely exposed, clutching my useless little hatchet for comfort. Sleep didn't come easy, but eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. I dreamt of wandering through a pitch black maze, hearing distant screams but finding no one. I woke up with a gasp, unsure what time it was. Mark was sitting up, his hatchet resting across his lap. "My turn to keep watch," I whispered. He just nodded, his eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. I sat up, leaning against the rough bark, fighting the urge to close my eyes. Time crawled by. Adrenaline and fear kept me awake until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. I woke Mark up, and we forced down another meager breakfast. The endless sea of trees stretched out before us, offering no clues to our location. A sense of dread washed over me. We were going to die in this forest, I was sure of it. Then Mark grabbed my shoulder. "Alex, look," he hissed. I followed his gaze and almost stopped breathing. Carved into a tree just off to our right was a symbol we recognized. It was part of the trail that had led us into the forest. "It's a way out," Mark yelled. His face lit up with hope. We scrambled over to examine the marking and quickly found more familiar symbols leading through the trees. We followed them eagerly, like lifelines thrown to drowning sailors. By late afternoon, we were climbing a ridge following the trail. We heard voices ahead, and our hearts leaped. Could it be? We rushed forward and were nearly tackled by Steve, Julie, and Jake. Their cries of relief and joy mingled with ours. They had been searching for us for days, and by some miracle, they had found this path again. "We'd nearly given up hope of finding you too," Steve said, grinning as he hugged me. Julie threw her arms around Mark. "Thank God you're all right," she murmured. "We've been so worried, man," Jake said, giving me a playful shake. We collapsed by their small camp, delirious with gratitude. We devoured the food they offered, taking turns recounting our separate ordeals. "We never found any trail leading out," Julie said, her voice haunted. "Just more of those disturbing markings." She shuddered. Mark took her hand. "It's going to be okay now that we found each other." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. Steve threw a branch into the fire. "I say we get up at the crack of dawn and hike straight back to the cars. No more weird detours. We're getting out of here. Enough is enough." We huddled close to the campfire, focusing on the warmth and the company, trying to forget the horrors of the past few days. But the next morning, as we packed up camp, a new sense of urgency filled the air. "Let's move fast today," Mark said, his eyes serious. "Stay sharp." I nodded, sliding my hatchet into my belt. We were getting out today, no matter what. We set off, following the trail of symbols again. But as we hiked, I noticed that the markings were different now. They were deeper, more aggressive, almost angry. We quickened our pace, ignoring our etching muscles and hunger pangs. The rising sun lit our path, but the shadows seemed to be closing in. I was scanning the trail ahead when a sharp cry pierced the air. It came from everywhere, and nowhere at once, then abruptly cut off, leaving an echoing silence. We froze, whipping our heads around. "Jake!" Julie yelled, but there was no answer. He had been right next to her just a moment ago, and now he was gone. Where did it come from? Which way? Steve shouted, his eyes darting around frantically. But the source of the cry was impossible to pinpoint. Mark gripped his hatchet, his knuckles white. "Stay together. Keep your eyes open." We huddled close, calling Jake's name, but only silence answered. Whatever lurked in this forest had snatched him away, swiftly and silently. Steve swayed, leaning against a tree for support. "Oh God, this can't be real." Julie collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Mark helped her up, his own eyes filled with tears. I felt numb and helpless. Jake was gone. We had to accept that any hope of saving him had vanished just as quickly as he had. Mark turned to me, anguish etched on his face. "We can't leave him out here alone. Not while there's any chance." His voice broke. I grasped his shoulder, knowing we had to try something. "You and Julie keep searching around here. Steve and I will hike out to get help." Julie's eyes flashed with hope. She grabbed a rope from her pack and handed it to Mark. "We'll keep calling for him. I know you'll find us again." Steve stared at the shadowy trees, but he nodded. "Yeah, we'll move quickly and bring back whoever we can." We clasped arms, and I gave Julie my fire starter. "Light this if you get lost. We'll spot the signal." She squeezed my hand, blinking back tears. Mark drew his hatchet and handed it to me. "Use this to mark your way, and be fast." I gripped the handle tightly as we embraced. Then, Steve and I turned and followed the trail out, glancing back to see Mark and Julie searching for Jake, their voices echoing through the trees. Steve and I hiked as fast as we could, the rising sun casting long shadows through the trees. We used Mark's hatchet to blaze a trail, hoping to make it easier for the rescue party to find us. We had to get help, and fast. But as we hurried along, I felt a growing sense of dread. The symbols carved into the trees seemed to be getting more and more disturbing, like a twisted mockery of our escape. We pushed on, ignoring our exhaustion and hunger. We had to find help for Jake, for Julie, for Mark. By midday, we reached a rocky clearing where the trail disappeared. We searched frantically, but the symbols were gone. "This can't be happening," Steve exclaimed, his voice filled with frustration. We were lost again. But giving up wasn't an option. We picked a direction and kept moving, praying that we'd stumble upon the trail again. An icy knot of fear settled in my stomach. We were alone, vulnerable, and hunted. Late in the afternoon, we found another cluster of symbols carved into a fallen tree. We followed the trail with renewed hope, only to have it disappear again as dusk approached. Exhausted and disoriented, we made camp under a hemlock tree, the darkness pressing in around us. We didn't dare light a fire. Sleep was a distant memory. My mind was haunted by visions of Jake and the others, lost and alone in the woods. At first light, we forced down a meager breakfast and continued our desperate journey. The woods seemed even more tangled and menacing than before. But after a few miles, the trees began to thin, and sunlight streamed through the branches. A gravel path appeared ahead. We had found the road out. With renewed energy, we ran down the path until it led us to a small ranger station. I almost collapsed with relief at the sight of other human beings. The ranger's eyes widened as we told our story. He immediately radioed for backup while we guzzled water and devoured the food they offered. Before long, a search party was assembled: rangers, search dogs, medics. We led them back into the woods, my heart pounding with every step. We reached the spot where we had last seen our friends, but there was no sign of them, just the ashes of a cold campfire. The search dogs scoured the area, but they couldn't find any scent, no tracks, no trail. They were simply gone. A heavy dread fell over the group as we searched the surrounding woods, but there were no clues, just endless trees and shadows. Then we heard it, a distant wailing, echoing through the trees. It sounded like a mournful siren, rising and falling in an unearthly rhythm. The hair on my neck prickled. Every instinct screamed at me to run. In the following days, helicopters searched from above, while police, medics, and SWAT teams combed the area. But they found nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. After a week, the search was called off. My friends were never found. It's been over 20 years since that camping trip, but I still think about it every day. The friends I lost, the evil we awakened, it haunts me. I left Alaska soon after, desperate to outrun the nightmares, but the memories haven't faded. I should have tried harder to turn back, to resist the pull of that trail, but the curiosity of youth blinded me. Steve turned to alcohol to numb the pain, but I know the shadows still haunt him. I've tried to shut it all out, to move on with my life. But at night, my dreams take me back to that forest. I hear their cries, just out of reach. The official story is that my friends got lost in the wilderness. But I know the truth. Something ancient and hungry lives in those woods, luring travelers to their doom. We awakened it, and my friends paid the price.